What Lisa's going to bring to us is some new, innovative, really creative ideas on student funding. Some of them have begun to be implemented, at least we're thinking about it in North Carolina, but this is really cutting edge stuff that I'm very pleased to be able to bring you all in the loop on this. I think you're going to have a lot to think about. I will tell you that yesterday, our meeting with the legislators, we finally had to say, y'all have got to go home. We just, we can't talk about this anymore. Yeah, I mean, they would still be here talking about it, I think, had we left the door open. So there just was, there's a lot to think about, and the ideas that Lisa is talking about have met with a very, very favorable reception at the General Assembly. So these are things that you're going to be hearing more about if you are serving in the General Assembly or in a Council of State position in 2017. I think these are some of the ideas and all that are going to be on your plate. They will come across your desk as we do it. So again, I'm very pleased to have Lisa with us. What we're going to do, very similar to what we did before, we're going to videotape kind of her formal presentation. She's got a PowerPoint and those kind of things. There were several people, actually just about everybody who had to leave from the earlier session said, I'm just sick that I can't be here. So we wanted to make that available to them. Also, she's going to give you a lot of information and a lot of stuff to think about. And so we wanted to capture that on videotape so that you can go back and look at it too and review it, tomorrow, next week, and in the, the next months and perhaps the next years. Just kind of a preview too, the Locke Foundation and the Reason Foundation, and actually Lisa and Terry Stoops are going to be working very closely on a North Carolina specific study of some of these ideas that we're talking about. So there will be more information coming out in the next couple months, and if you will make a note on your card, once again, I will be sure that you're in the loop on that and that you have not only the copy of the PowerPoint presentation, some additional information that Lisa has available, but as we move forward with that, I'll make sure that you are in the loop on that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa.
Start that. 20 years ago. 1994. So, yeah. We're really old. I'm really old. Thank you, Rick. I appreciate that. So I'm going to start today with a story about something that is viral on the internet today. And it is a story of a tiger and a goat. And that might seem kind of strange for an education presentation. The tiger's name is Amir, and the goat's name is Timur. So strangely, their names rhyme. The tiger is in a Russian zoo, and in October, the goat, Timur, was given to the tiger as a meal. And the goat didn't know that he was supposed to be afraid of the tiger. And a strange thing happened. The tiger and the goat became best friends, and now in January, the tiger and the goat are still living together in the zoo in Russia. And now all of these different science organizations are installing cameras and want to study this odd behavior. And the goat even kicked the tiger out of his shelter during a rainstorm because he was too crowded, and the tiger went and followed the goat. So the lesson from the story of the tiger and the goat in the Russian zoo is that things that we think are true are not always supported by data. And when you look at education policy, I think it's always very important to keep this in mind. We often hear that schools don't have enough funding, or on the other side of the fence, we often hear that low-income, disadvantaged kids generate the most income, and they just don't spend it effectively, when in reality, they often generate money that never reaches the teachers and the classes in which they are actually enrolled, and are spent along the way, even though we think of that money as being attached to them. So what I'd like to do today is I'm going to get to this $578 million building on the right in a minute, but I'd like to just set up, why do we care about doing something different about education finance in North Carolina or school reform more generally in the United States? What are some of the school choice options that are going around the country? And then more specifically, I'm going to get to the project in North Carolina with the Locke Foundation and the idea of school finance being in a child's backpack or following the kid and why that's important in the United States, why it's important in North Carolina. And I'm going to see if I can work my PowerPoint. So and here is where the tiger and the goat comes in with this story. In Los Angeles, this is one of the most expensive high schools in the United States. It was built on the site of the old Ambassador Hotel, and it cost $578 million. And a few years ago, I had a debate of the then superintendent of Los Angeles Unified, who was an admiral in the Navy, and for some reason they thought that that would make him qualified for running a multi-billion-dollar school district. Turned out that didn't work out so well for Admiral Brewster, but he argued that they needed to spend another $20 billion on schools in Los Angeles because of overcrowding. Right now in Los Angeles, the LA Times and the LA Daily News yesterday published a story about how Los Angeles is, in effect, Detroit. They've lost 200,000 students since 2002, while they have opened over 100 new schools, and they have not closed a single school. So you can imagine that in Los Angeles, there's a lot of schools that are at 30% capacity that are paying for full staffs. And they say that the LA Unified, Los Angeles Unified, will be bankrupt completely by 2017. So Los Angeles is going to be an interesting story. What will they do about their multi-million-dollar deficits? This year they have a $300 million deficit, and that's just projected to keep increasing. But anyway, the argument of Admiral Brewer was that if students had really nice buildings and we revitalized the schools in Los Angeles, kids would learn better. And we often hear many versions of this story. If we pay teachers more, if we spend more money, if we invest our resources in education, and again, I'm not against investing resources in education, but if we do that in a way where we don't look at what we're spending our money on in an evidence-based way, it often doesn't work out very well for children. This is the Teacher's Lounge at the Robert F. Kennedy School. This is the theater for the students that are doing drama. At this school, they also have a kitchen that rivals the Food Network. They have sound rooms for students for the art that rival any studio of any professional musician that you would want to find. And yet, so right now we're in a suspension of testing in California, so we haven't had any test scores for 2 years, hence the 2013 data. But because of the crunch of low enrollment in LA Unified, they actually had to open 5 schools in that building to get it at capacity. So 5 different schools are sharing the Robert F. Kennedy Community Schools, and they're all losing points on our academic performance index. And in California, that takes all graduation rates, test scores. It aggregates all performance and its index, and you want your numbers to be positive, not negative, from one year to another. So this is just an example of spending a lot of money and having a beautiful place to learn is no guarantee that you will do better in school. And it's counterintuitive because we think if we invest lots of resources in kids, in Newark, for example, one of the most expensive school districts in the country, they're encroaching on $30,000 a kid, and yet they have one of the lowest graduation rates in the country. So resources are not necessarily correlated with outcomes, so we've known that for a long time. Thank you to the Cato Institute for this slide. In the last, since 1970, the first line in here, let's see how good I am at using the pointer, if I can actually do that. Maybe not. Oh, there it is. Okay. So this first line, right, spending overall on education in the United States has gone up by 200%. Staffing has gone way up Enrollment is this dotted line, not so much. Test scores, reading and math and science for 17-year-olds in the country. When we spent this much, pretty much they're reading the same as when we spent this much, right? So things aren't looking so good nationally in terms of performance and spending. We spend a lot, and if you look at ACT scores, SAT scores, other kinds of indicators, this is one measure, the National Assessment of Education Progress, which is known as the nation's report card, but other measures mirror this. State-level data also mirrors this. Federal spending on education, again, let's see if I can get that down there, way up, right? The federal government spends way more money than they did in 1970, and again, we see across the bottom everything is flat. How do we stack up compared to other nations? Well, we spend a lot. We spend, really, Switzerland and the United States are the highest K-12 spending in all of the OECD developed countries in the world. So we're not a low spending country in the United States on education. We spend a lot. And what does all that spending mean? Well, the OECD did a study of student achievement and spending, and what they found is countries that spend more than $100,000 per student from 6 to 15, which would be us, we get about the same outcomes as countries that spend $50,000 per student over that same time period. So we're scoring with Estonia, Hungary, Poland. New Zealand spends even less than Hungary and Poland, and they have higher, they're a top performer. So again, international data tells us that spending and performance is not necessarily linked. It doesn't mean that spending couldn't help, but in general, it's not a silver bullet. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is, I'm going to start with the overall idea of this is, in the United States and mostly around the world, we don't attach the money that we spend to kids. So when we think of higher education, if you go to Stanford and your parents pay, or you get a Pell Grant, or the federal government gives you a loan, however you get money to pay for Stanford, or Stanford gives you a scholarship, that money is attached to you. It goes to Stanford. There's not a central office that decides that UC Berkeley is subsidizing Stanford to 10 to 15%. The money is actually attached to the higher education student, and we would think it was bizarre if we had some redistribution stream that did not attach tuition to kids. Now, public universities are a little different because they have state budgets and they have money attached to kids, right? And so the UC system in California gets several $billion from the state of California, and they charge kids tuition per kid that is attached to them. So public universities, it's not as close of a connection. But anyway, so what do we want to do in the United States to make economics of education make sense is, like every other service, we want education, the money, to be attached to the person that actually gets the services. And we want the people that are providing the services to know if they don't provide services to the kid, there's a chance that that money could go somewhere else. But mostly it works like LA Unified. If you're at 30% capacity and 60% of the kids aren't coming, do you still have a janitor and a principal and a counselor? All of that staffing is still at your school, and it's not attached to the kids. But if Stanford lost 60% of their kids to UC Berkeley, I can guarantee you that some of their staff would be gone, even though there's a terrible staffing up problem in higher education as well. So school choice is one way, in addition to the obvious benefits that we want parents to be responsible for their child's education, that we have choices in everything else in our life. I went to a fabulous Greek restaurant next to my hotel last night. That was, well, it was John Locke's choice, but it was a fabulous choice. And, you know, if I had to choose where I ate the same way that I choose where my kids go to school, the food might not be as good. So we want to make education more related to customers and more sensitive to the financing and the economics that's funding it, so that people make decisions about how they spend the money, just like we have to do in every other sector of life. So right now in the United States, it's kind of a drop in the bucket. We have close to 50 million kids in school. We have 51 school choice programs, which is way more than we used to. And these are across the United States and DC. There's 23 voucher programs, 18 tax credit programs. I think we're up to 6 education savings accounts. I need to update my slide. We have about 300,000 kids that the government actually does pay money to a private school for them to attend. And then we have another 800,000 kids that parents get tax relief for spending their own money on private education. Then in the charter school sector, we have 6,700 public charter schools with about 2.9 million kids. Now, charter schools have more government regulation than private schools. They're not as market-oriented or customer or charter school leaders will tell you that I've never actually met a regulation that I'm exempt from, even though everyone touts their autonomy. They have much scrutiny from the government, and they still are subject to lots of rules and regulation from the government. And yet, the charter sector seems to be thriving one school at a time, comparatively. So, again, though, less than 3 million kids in charter schools, 300,000 kids in private schools, maybe 1 million kids are homeschooled. There's open school enrollment and magnet schools, different variations of public school choice. But still, less than 4 million kids probably total out of 50 million kids are in some kind of what we would think of a more robust choice-based option. Really a drop in the bucket. That means that $600 billion a year in local, state, and federal money is still supporting a public school monopoly in an economic system that is not at all sensitive in any way to the resources that are spent in the system. So we have a lot of work to do in North Carolina and the rest of the world to make education look as good as healthcare. So that's a scary thought, right? Because in healthcare, we get worried about having a single payer system, right? Like that's what you hear about Obamacare or blah, blah, blah. In education, we have a single payer. We have a single provider, right? So it's a sad thing to say that education reform is way behind healthcare reform structurally in terms of economic incentives, but it is. So that's a lot of kind of depressing news or exciting news, however you want to look at it. So what I want to talk about now is kind of more wonky and in the weeds, and that is the idea about even in a public school, can we make school funding be funded more like higher education? With all the flaws of higher education and the taxpayer money that we spend on it, at least the money is attached to the kids and they have some competition that someone knows, right? I mean, UNC Chapel Hill is definitely competing with other state-run universities in North Carolina in a way that a school in Raleigh, I don't know if I say that right, is not necessarily competing with a school in Charlotte in any way. And obviously K-12, you have geographic areas of competition. People aren't going to be driving all over the country to take their kids to preschool or to kindergarten or to 12th grade. But still, there are ways to make the money attached to the kids. And first of all, why would we want to do that? And one of the things that we think is true about education is that both Title I dollars and states attach extra money to disadvantaged kids, right? Don't we hear a lot about Halifax in North Carolina and that they spend more than everybody else? We hear that a lot. So that's what we think is true, and it is true. Obviously, there's more revenue from government organizations generated for low-income kids. But one of the things that the federal government did is when they gave the American, the ERA money, the American 2010, 2011, $100 billion to school, American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, right? ERA, I got it. $100 billion to schools. They asked every state to report out actual spending at the school level. And what they found is that the schools that were getting the extra government money for poor kids were spending a lot less state and local money on those kids. And in fact, it completely washed out the money the feds were spending. And why is that? Why would what we know to be true, that we've generated all this revenue for poor kids, why? So I'm not going to go through this whole slide. It tells you like the percentages of schools and different grade levels. But the bottom line is they found that they were paying money to Title I schools who were spending less state and local money, and there were thousands of dollars difference in some cases in the same school district from one school to another. So in LA, a poor school, the district was financing it at a lot lower level than a more wealthy school, even though those kids in the poor school were generating way more revenue for LA Unified than the wealthier kids. Well, the reason is because we have a staffing formula, and I'm actually going to pause here, so don't pay attention to that because I'm going to tell you a bunch of stuff before we get to that. So in the United States, we have a staffing formula in most places, and in North Carolina, you actually have an allotment for teachers where the state actually gives school counties, I guess here, positions instead of dollars. So North Carolina is the only place in the United States that does that. Everyone else gives counties and districts money, not positions. So in a way, the state of North Carolina is a huge central office. They act as if they are LA Unified. And so in a way, you're farther behind the curve because most places at least give money to, they give a funding amount based on the kids. And if kids leave, you don't get the funding amount. And the inequities really emerge from personnel, because if you have two schools in the same school district or in two different school districts, if one school has staff that make $50,000 and one school has staff that make $30,000, if they each get 10 teachers, one of them actually is getting more money than the other, right? And what happens with patterns in personnel is that teachers, rightly so, move to schools that have kids that are not as disadvantaged, in that these schools are more efficient, more productive, the kids are easier. And so schools that have the neediest students often have the lowest paid teachers and the most turnover. If you give schools the dollars, then the needier school could buy 3 teachers for the 1 teacher over here if they had the dollars their kids generated. But if you give them the positions, they're actually getting a lot less money. So even when their kids are generating that revenue for a county or a district, at the school level, the money they're spending is less. And the district is actually subsidizing someone else's salary with the money that low-income kid generated. And this is proven by evidence all over the United States. And right now there's not school-level reporting in North Carolina. And so we really don't know if this is happening. It might not be. I mean, maybe somehow North Carolina has survived this phenomenon and every single classroom has an equal amount of spending based on what their kids generate. But we don't know that because it's not transparent. School actual dollars is not reported at the county level or the school level in a way that is easy for legislators, policymakers, taxpayers, parents. There is a report somewhere. It's not that you're not doing school finance and that people don't know. Obviously, teachers get checks and they cash at the bank and the money's being allocated. But so that's really the first step in any kind of system where you would want to reform school finance, is a lot of states are moving to school level reporting. So Colorado has a new bill where they have required a user-friendly website. And I know in North Carolina you've done this for other government institutions, where you actually want to know not what the average is spent on salaries in Charlotte or in Raleigh, but what does X school spend and what money would their kids have generated based on a formula. And that's really the only way you can know. And this isn't a question of performance. This is a question of legislator intent and equity. If you've said that you owe every child an equal education and that you're spending $9,000 per kid, say, in North Carolina, is that money going, like, is one school getting $4,000 a kid and another school getting $12,000? It just logically doesn't make sense. So you need to sort that out. So the whole idea that I advocate for at my center at the Reason Foundation is just that we, in every case, attach money to the child and that we report that out in a transparent way. And so I've been working on a commission with Governor Ducey in Arizona where he calls it A for Arizona is his initiative, and he's taken it even one step forward. He wants a single formula with all the categoricals collapsed, and then where he does spend extra money for poverty or English language learners or special education, it's very simple, so everyone can understand how the money gets to the kid. And it follows the kid to any charter school or any public school. And in Arizona, they're in a unique situation because 60% of the kids go out of residential assignment schools. And that may be kids from Phoenix going to Scottsdale, or it may be just they have one of the largest numbers of charter schools in the nation. So a lot of kids are going to charter schools there. So they're in a little bit different situation. But the interesting idea that Governor Ducey has is he's weighting performance instead of poverty. And in Arizona right now, there's about 150 schools that serve the most disadvantaged kids. So kids on the border in Nogales that are 100% English language learners and 100% Hispanic. How is it that this school on the border is scoring as an A in Arizona, right? I mean, it's rising against all of the expectations, and it has a waiting list. And there's 150 schools like this that have the most disadvantaged populations in Arizona. And so instead of giving all the money to failing schools, he wants to give money to high-performing schools to build capacity, to either replicate with another principal or to fund the waiting list at that school or to add another building. But he's weighting performance growth. So any school in Arizona in their new formula going forward that either already is sustaining an A status, or even if you're a D school and you moved up a few points to be a C school, he's not just weighting the number one top performers, he's weighting improvement. So that if you improve, you get more money and you can expand. And so that's kind of a novel idea with school funding, is that right now, whenever people fail, we focus all of our resources on the person that's failing, instead of letting the people that aren't failing, especially with similar kinds of kids, grow. And so I would encourage you to take a look at what Governor Ducey's doing, because I don't think there's anything unique about Arizona that makes it where other people can't do that. And then I'm going to look at how much time I've been taking really quick, maybe. And then I'm going to talk about some other places. Oh, I never started my timer. Never mind. So anyway, I'm going to move on to New Orleans because it's kind of the opposite example of Arizona. New Orleans had a hurricane, and it voided all of the union contracts in the state, and all of the school system collapsed. And they started from scratch with nonprofit providers, and basically the state took over they were already low-performing schools in New Orleans anyway, and they had had a state law for the recovery school district. But when the hurricane hit, they basically took over every school in New Orleans, and they reopened them with nonprofit providers. So right now, on this slide, 91% of students in New Orleans went to charter schools, but now actually 100% of kids in New Orleans go to charter schools, and there's no more public schools in the city of New Orleans. That's about 60,000 kids in one area that are all going to nonprofit providers. So it's really one of our only tests of what we would call a market in education. And so 98% of the state funding is attached to the kid and goes to the nonprofit provider. There's no central office. There's no state central office. It's a group of nonprofit schools working cooperatively together that get 98% of the funding. The other 2% is kept by the state to do things like testing and monitoring and that kind of stuff. So this is a study that was done that shows where New Orleans was before Hurricane Katrina hit. And the green dotted line is a matched comparison of other districts in Louisiana. And they were way behind them. You can see that by 2012, New Orleans kids had exceeded the matched comparison in this study. And this is true across multiple indicators in New Orleans. A recent research study by Tulane University found that they had a 0.4 effect size in terms of student achievement. And that surpasses preschool. It surpasses class size reduction. It's a huge amount of gain, a 0.4 effect size in education studies. The ACT scores rose from the 25th to the 40th percentile in 3 years in New Orleans. Half of New Orleans high schools earned a letter grade of A or B. 5 years ago, only 2 high schools in the city were an A or a B. So you can see just in 1 year, from 2014 to 2015, there's positive movement. And in a minute, I'm going to go to, so New Orleans is a pure example of student-based budgeting. All the money follows the kids to nonprofit providers. There's no central bureaucracy. It's been completely relinquished. And across multiple, so people say it's not fair, kids, there's critics of New Orleans. But if you look at graduation rates, if you look at what Black African-American males are doing, whatever you look at, it's been moving in a rapid positive direction, unlike any other city. So let's move to Cleveland, which I think is another good example. A few years ago, we did a series called Reason Saves Cleveland with Drew Carey. And we had a series of 10 videos, and they focused on things like fix the schools. And I'm going to talk about fix the schools, because that's the video that I worked on producing. And we advocated that the money should follow the child in Cleveland, and that they should have open enrollment, and principals should have autonomy over their budgets. And that's what I'm proposing with this project with John Locke that we do here in North Carolina. And in Cleveland, after we had this series, the city council invited us to testify, and we sent Nick Gillespie, who's the editor of Reason.com and our biggest star at Reason, and then Drew Carey to testify in front of the city council. And the mayor proposed that they do student-based budgeting, and a few years later, Cleveland actually adopted it, and they've now been doing it for a few years. And after more than a decade of flat test results, Cleveland outscored 20 other large cities in 2015 on the National Assessment of Academic Progress. And Michael Casserly, who runs the Council of Great City Schools, which represents 68 large school districts in the country, he said that the gains in Cleveland were uniformly larger and better than any other school district in the country. And so in our research, when money follows the child, principals and schools change their behavior, because if they don't, they could actually lose money. So it's a novel concept. If you don't serve students and your students don't succeed, you don't get funded if they go somewhere else. It's remarkable, really. And what Cleveland did is they increased school-level control over school budgets to support school leaders and this is not the Wild West. It's not like you give a principal in Cleveland $5 million and you say, okay, you have a high school, you want a new computer lab, go for it. You want a new stadium, go for it. No, they still have to meet performance requirements of the district and the state. They have to get more kids to graduate, more kids to read, more kids to go to college. So again, this is bounded autonomy, because it's public money we're talking about, so it's not a school choice free market system. The district is still monitoring them, but we're actually giving principals the resources to decide what they need to make performance goals. And they increase school level flexibility. They had teacher teams actually collaborate based on the data with their principals. And so I'm going to go through this really quick. We did a study of all the districts in the United States that the money follows the child. So right now we're at about 40 districts, and the Broad Prize awards $1 million to the top performing district in the United States. And they have a methodology where they look at all the data and they can make comparisons between Cleveland and Charlotte and New York City, and they can say who's doing better. And so we put all of the districts through this Broad Prize methodology, which thousands of researchers besides me worked on the methodology ahead of time. We just stole it from them to see how these student-based budgeting districts were doing. And I'm going to really end with this. And we found that Houston is the best district in the country for the money following the child, and that they were performing the fastest. New Orleans isn't in this metric yet. And Baltimore City actually was the worst performing that was using student-based budgeting. And that means that on, fourth grade reading for low-income kids, graduation rates, it was more than 40 different metrics that we looked at, and then we aggregated them for grades. But one of the things that we looked at is, does it make a difference how much money follow the kids? And in most districts, when you do student-based budgeting, 50% of the operating budget goes to teachers' salaries about right now. And a lot of it goes to pensions and long-term obligations. There's things districts have to pay for. Debt, healthcare, that don't necessarily go to schools. So we're talking about the percentage of the operating budget that goes to a principal for discretion to hire staffing. And in Houston, 42% of the budget went to principals, and in Baltimore, 29% of the budget went to principals. And New Orleans is the only place that 98% of the money goes to school leaders. Most places it's between 30 and 50% at the high end. So that means if New York City is spending $25 billion on schools, in their student-based budgeting program, $5 billion, 25%, is going to school leaders. And the New York City is spending $20 billion on something else besides what is happening in the schools. And what we found is we ran a bunch of tests on, does it matter as the money you spend and send to principals to make decision, do outcomes go up for kids? And it's complicated, but the bottom line is yes. The more money that follows kids, the better the students actually did in the district. So on the high end, we have Minneapolis, and the green dot is actually showing the probability of the gap closing, and then so that looked at student achievement gaps, like how much difference was there between low-income kids and higher-income kids, and did the district close those gaps over time? The more money they spent, the faster they closed the gaps. A similar test that we ran, we included New Orleans in this special study that we're doing on New Orleans. With 100% of the money following the kids, basically, we can see that this looked at how fast improvement improved in a district over time. And New Orleans outscored all of our other weighted student formula for how fast. So the bottom line is that money really does matter. And people that are close to the schools making decisions about the money, we have a lot of angst about the fact that principals will just be ordering pencils and toilet paper for the bathrooms, and they can't be both CFOs and instructional leaders of their schools. But it turns out that when you use your resources to determine your priorities around school instruction, your school improves. If you actually have the money to decide that you need reading coaches in your school, or you want to have a block schedule where your science and math teacher keep 300 kids for half the day, and you want to try innovative things at the margins. So this is not like doing some rocket science thing. This is just using your resources to, as a school, look at your instructional priorities and spend money to raise math scores, or to get kids to stay in school, or to raise your graduation rate. Like, what is it you need to improve in, and how would it help you to use your resources to do that? And so what I'm advocating in North Carolina with John Locke is that, first of all, you have a transparent and equitable funding system where everyone knows how much money each school gets. In 2015, we have data and technology tools that allow us to know at the building level what actual salaries and per pupil amount is being spent. And we can compare that to what the students in that school have generated for a county or a district or a state. And we can ask, why is one school spending $18,000 and another school spending $7,000? And is that fair? Is there something inherently different? And sometimes there are. If we've weighted low-income kids and you have 100% poverty, we would think that you would be spending more. But if we don't know, we can't make decisions as policymakers. The second is the idea that funding should be portable. It should always be portable and attached to the kids. We do that with preschool. We do it with higher education. It's weird that we fund inputs and janitors and food service and staffing, that we start with the things we want to buy instead of starting with the revenue that kids have generated. It's a weird way to budget, and no one else does it except for schools. That we give local schools autonomy. In the United States, 30% of kids overall are in choice schools, and in some places like New Orleans and Los Angeles, 50% of the kids are going to schools of choice. This is not going back, right? More and more people, especially as technology advances, are not going to be picking K-12 schools built on their residential assignment. Does this mean that we want parents to have to drive all over a region? No, it means that we want a principal to know that 5 kids could leave. And if those 5 kids left, that would be $50,000 that the school would leave. And we want them to get better so the 5 kids stay in their neighborhood school. It's not about sending people all over the state. It's about incentivizing people to change their behavior so their schools get better. And the only way to do that is when you use the money. We want transparency again. We want a service-oriented school district. We don't want a school district being an operations manager or the state of North Carolina deciding on operations in the school. We want them to monitor schools to make sure that they meet accountability benchmarks and performance. So we want the state of North Carolina to be service-oriented, we want the counties to be service-oriented, and we want the schools to be responsible for operations, performance, and how they organize their day. So the last thing is people have to be accountable. Do we want kids to read and write? Do we want them to be at grade level? Do we want them to learn science? There's simple things that we want kids to know. We want them to be able to enroll in the universities in North Carolina and not have to take remedial math and language arts classes. We don't want to pay for that again after we've already spent $100,000 in the state on their education. So all of these things together work out to a portable school funding system, and that's what we're going to be working on together with John Locke, and that's what we want to do here. And a baby step is just to know how the money is spent in the state. School choice is winning in America. We spend more money than any other developed country in the world, and we don't right now have a lot to show for that. We have economic freedom in this country, and that means that we still do better than everyone else. If we had high-performing kids and economic freedom, both of those things working together, we could do so much better in terms of our quality of life for the people that live in our country and in the state of North Carolina.